Okay, guys, here we are on the respiratory system. I'm going to talk a little bit about gas exchange first. We'll talk about partial pressures and drive for diffusion. Then we'll talk about oxygen loading and unloading. Then we'll talk about ventilation. And then we'll talk about how you regulate that ventilation. Let's start with respiration. So the respiratory system does three kind of related functions. The first is ventilation. Ventilation is the fancy way of just saying bringing air into and out of the lungs, so breathing in and out. That is ventilation. And then in the alveoli, that's where you have gas exchange. That's how you bring the oxygen into the body, carbon dioxide out. So you have gas exchange twice. You have gas exchange between the alveoli, so the spaces in the alveoli and the blood. Then you have gas exchange again between the blood and then the cells of the body. And then don't forget that this whole thing, everything that we're talking about today, that all comes back to cellular respiration, right? So we don't breathe for no reason. We breathe because we need that oxygen to be the final electron acceptor in the electron transfer chain of cellular respiration. That's why we breathe. And then we also breathe because we need to get rid of the CO2, which is produced by the Krebs cycle and transition phase of cellular respiration. So again, it's all tied into the process of making energy. That's the point of the whole respiratory system. So don't lose sight of that fact. You can also separate the respiration into external respiration. That would be exchanges between the external environment and the body. And then you can also talk about internal respiration, which would be the exchange, and then again, the use of that oxygen. Okay, let's do a little bit of an anatomy review just because I know not all of us remember our anatomy. So when we look at the lower respiratory structures, often they're called the respiratory tree because it looks like an upside down tree. You have the trachea, that is the windpipe that brings the air down in, that branches into the primary, secondary, then tertiary bronchi. So all of these would be the bronchi here. They then branch into the smaller bronchioles, which go to the terminal bronchioles. And then finally, you end with the little sacs, and these little sacs of air, those are called alveoli. And there's two functional regions of the respiratory tree. You have conducting zones. That just means that they move air around. They're just conducting the movement of air from one place to another place, but you don't have any gas exchange in those structures. So those would be the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles. Then you have the respiratory zones, and the respiratory zones, that's where you actually bring the oxygen into the body and the carbon dioxide out. And that primarily occurs in those alveoli right there. Now, in the alveoli, the structure of the alveoli is set up so that they're very, very good at that exchange. They have a lot of surface area, so instead of one giant sac, the alveoli make a bunch of tiny little circles. And the more little circles you have, and you've seen this over and over again, the more little circles you have, the more surface area you have, the amount of space at a surface. And the reason for that is if you're going to be going through this surface, okay, exchanging, it has to be at a surface. So the amount of surface you have, the amount more exchange you have. So just look at the amount of blue line here, right? Lots and lots of blue line on this side, less on this side. So this is going to have more exchange than this. And that's why you have a bunch of little alveoli instead of bigger alveoli. And then the other thing is, remember that they're made up of simple squamous epithelium. So they're very, very thin, and that thin allows them to have very easy exchange. Okay, so most of you hopefully already heard all of that in anatomy. Let's get into exchange, into physiology concepts. Starting with the idea of pressure. So when you think about pressure and we think about the air, we tend to think of the air as sort of just emptiness, like there's nothing there. But if you move your hand around, you're feeling something. What you're feeling is gas particles. Okay, so you have gas particles all throughout the air. So it's not nothing, there's molecules there. And so what pressure is if you take those molecules and you give them a particular space to be, a space to occupy is what I usually say, that's going to create pressure. So pressure is two parts. It's just the same as a concentration that we already talked about when we talked about diffusion. There's two parts to it. There's the amount of molecules, so the number of molecules, and then there's the volume or space that they're allowed to occupy. Okay, so two parts to that. And so if you take all of those molecules, you have the total pressure is all of the molecules all together in a particular space. That's the total pressure. And the total pressure is going to be equal to the partial pressure of each individual gas molecule. Okay, so this P, anytime you see a big P like that, the big P stands for partial pressure, or the piece of the whole. Okay, so this is called Dalton's law, right? If you take all of the partial pressure of A and you add it to the partial pressure of B and the partial pressure of C, you're going to get the total pressure of everything. That's Dalton's law. And so when we look at the gas molecules in the air around us, we have nitrogen, which is nitrogen here, so the partial pressure of nitrogen plus the partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide and gaseous water, so like steam, that is, and when you add them all together, that is going to give you the total pressure in the atmosphere. So if you are at sea level, the total pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. So the unit for the pressure is millimeters of mercury. Okay, so mmHg just stands for millimeters of mercury, so 760. Now, if you go higher up, you'll have less pressure. So if you go up a mountain, Mount Everest, you'll have less pressure. And you go deeper down, so if we go, for example, you go deep down in the ocean, you'll have more and more pressure. Okay, so that's partial pressure. So again, if you see a big P like that, that just stands for partial pressure. So when you're talking about movements of molecules, movements of those little gases, the gases are going to follow their very own partial pressure, okay, not total pressure. And so when you're looking at this right here, so for example, in this picture here, this gray circle stands for the alveoli. You have in the alveoli, you have your air, so you have a total pressure. But when you're looking at the movement of the molecules are only going to be concerned with their very own partial pressure. Okay, so for example, oxygen. This oxygen is always going to move from high to low. It's not looking at the total pressure of all the molecules, just its very own gradient. Okay, so moves from high to low again, just like you've already seen for concentration gradients for diffusion, this exact same principle. Okay, so because the alveoli, when you breathe in, because there's a higher partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli than in the blood, that's going to move through the cells of the alveoli and then move through the cells of the capillary walls into the blood. Okay, so it'll go from the alveoli into it. It's a very kind of elegant system, very simple. So it's going to move from simple diffusion, because remember, oxygen is both small, only two tiny little atoms, see, two tiny little atoms, and nonpolar, because both oxygen, when it's with another oxygen, so they're both oxygen, it's going to be nonpolar, because they're going to share those electrons equally. Okay, so it's small and nonpolar, that allows for easy, simple diffusion along its partial pressure gradient. Okay, now looking at carbon dioxide here. For carbon dioxide, the opposite will be true, right? So where does the carbon dioxide come from in the first place? Our cells are producing it as they do cellular respiration. Okay, so that means that in the veins, feeding into the capillary beds, they're going to have a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood than in the alveoli. That means that the carbon dioxide is going to move along its partial pressure gradient from higher pressure to lower pressure. And then in the cells, when you're dropping off the oxygen, because those cells are using up the oxygen in cellular respiration in the mitochondria there, that means that they'll have lower oxygen in the cells because they're using it up, turning it into water. And so that allows for easy, simple diffusion of oxygen into the cells where they are needed. And because the carbon dioxide is produced during the cellular respiration, that means that they'll have a higher concentration of carbon dioxide. So again, that means greater than. And then again, the carbon dioxide will just move along the partial pressure gradient. Okay, so for now, the main concept is to understand that when you're talking about movement or predicting the movement of particular gases, they're going to follow their very own partial pressures, not the total partial pressure. Okay? Okay, so this creates the pulmonary circuit. So let's look at that. Let's look at how the blood moves through the whole body again. Okay, so here is the right ventricle. The right ventricle pumps the blood to the lungs. And in the lungs, the blood is going to be low in oxygen because all of the oxygen was taken up by the cells. And it's going to be high in carbon dioxide. So the oxygen and the carbon dioxide will move along their own partial pressure gradient, and this will make it so that the oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood, and then the carbon dioxide will diffuse out. That will then take the blood back to the left atrium and then the left ventricle. And so now we have a very high partial pressure of oxygen and a lower partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And so as it travels through the body from the arteries to the arterioles to the capillary beds, in those capillary beds, it's going to come in close contact with those cells, and it's going to have exchange. And again, the oxygen and the carbon dioxide will follow their own partial pressure gradients. Because the cells are using up the oxygen, that means that they'll be lower inside of the cells than outside of the cells. And so the oxygen will go into the cells, and the carbon dioxide, which is made by the cells, will come out into the blood, and it just goes back and continues on. Right? So it's a very, I really think that this is a very impressive system. Notice I haven't talked about any active transport, okay? So besides the energy used to make the blood flow through the contraction of the heart, besides that, we don't need any active transport. We don't need any giant mechanisms. It really is just a very elegant, simple diffusion based upon partial pressure gradients. So honestly, I feel like it's amazing the way that it works. Okay. So I'm going to stop there and make a separate one for talking about hemoglobin and how oxygen is transported.